Perfect. All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody, on this beautiful Tuesday, yet another beautiful Tuesday. It's so good to see you all, and I am very excited to dive into our learning from last week and do some sharing and also to talk about what is to come for this week's content. Um, Before we get started, does anybody have an announcement or any burning questions that they want to get off their chest before we start? No new babies in the world or so we were sharing how many days left of school. Sharon, go ahead.
Oh, nothing. I'm going to have another grandchild. That was new news on Sunday. That had nothing to do with class.
That's so exciting. Congratulations. Oh, it's the best. Yeah, my sister's having a baby in a few months, so we're counting down the days for another cousin in the family. Um, Yay. All right. Anything else?
How I used to know how to do this too. It used to be the three dots. I could change my name, but it's not giving me that option.
Yeah, it must mean that my settings doesn't allow
Okay.
participants to change their own names. So I'll see if I can tweak that next time so you have that permission for yourself. Yeah, thanks, Sharon. Awesome. Does anybody have any birthdays during our class, just so we know? No. Okay. I'm at June 28th, so I'm always right after the course ends. All right. Awesome. Well, let's jump in then. I'm going to share my screen. Nope. And we have Andy right there. Great. Okay. So we are in our second week of our 5-week class. And so this week we will be in the online content diving into this idea of a translanguaging stance more deeply and thinking about multilingual ecologies all around us through our linguistic landscape and schoolscape project. Um, the agenda for our online class is, let me check the chat. Oh, Chloe, yeah, I meant anyone who has a birthday within the time frame of the course. Awesome. All right. We'll have to make sure that we celebrate you as it approaches. Happy early birthday. Um, our agenda for today, we'll start with some announcements. So we had a few quick ones, and I have two more, and then we'll talk about we'll go back to that question, what is translanguaging? Now that you have read more deeply about it, engaged with some more content around it, kind of thinking about your evolving definition of translanguaging. And then I want to spend a little bit of time situating the concept of translanguaging for you historically, and then talking about some key concepts that you've been learning about in the reading, and have some time for questions and dialogue. And then from there, I'm going to put you in breakout groups, and you'll have a chance to share your language portrait and your I am from poem that you wrote for this week or this past week. And then we'll come back, have a brief group reflection, and then we'll spend the last part of class talking about what is coming up this week with week two. And we'll talk specifically about not only the content, but kind of what is that project that you'll be working on. So you're all set to do that for Sunday. So that is where we're headed. Why don't we move? So the one announcement I had was I've graded all the discussion boards for week one. So if you have any questions about it, let me know. In general, folks did well. It was great to read what you had to say. There were a few people who lost a point here or there for not kind of bringing in kind of the broad scope of the readings and just making sure that you're bringing in different quotes or concepts and ideas. But in general, it was just great to see how you were making sense of translanguaging and thinking about it in relation to your own practice. And then I added some APA feedback as well. So if you got any of that, just check that feedback so you know for next time, kind of ways to cite, so you can get that moving forward. So as you look at that feedback, please, I'm always happy to hear if you have questions and if you have responses to some questions I posed to you about some of the things you're reflecting on, always feel free to write me or to drop that into an email too. So with that, and well, I guess did anyone have any questions about the discussion board or anything there before we move into the second announcement? Okay, great. And it's always fun to see how people are making sense of it and where you're entering translanguaging from as you begin to dive into it more deeply. So thank you for that and for engaging with one another. So one other announcement is we had a classmate who joined us, wasn't with us when we did the introduction part, joined us a little bit later because she was traveling. And so Andy, I wanted to give you a chance to introduce yourself to everybody with the Foursquare that you made. So I'll hand it over to you to do that.
All right, hello everybody. Sorry again, I was late. Not last week. I was in Nashville and I totally forgot there was a time difference, so I joined an hour late. But yeah, my name is Andy Taraborelli. Here's a picture of me when I graduated from URI last year with my bachelor's. Um, I'm a pre-service teacher, and last year I did my student teaching in a third grade classroom in North Kingston. And then this year for EDC 519, I did my internship at a school in Cranston, Rhode Island. And I had all my students were MLL students. They came from 11 different countries and spoke 6 different languages. So I thought it was really cool. And then my why is I want to learn how to best utilize translanguaging in my future classroom because I have learned about translanguaging in past classes, but this class will allow me to go more in depth. And then something about me is that I love reading, watching movies, and spending time with family and friends. And my trip from Nashville was my trip for the summer. So, yeah, that's a little bit about me. Nice to meet you guys.
Awesome. Thanks for being here, Andy. And you're in good
Mhm.
company with the readers. There are a lot of folks who also love reading. And hope you had a good time in Nashville. Yeah,
Thank you.
time changes are the worst. I struggle with them so much. Anytime I'm like having a meeting with someone in a different place, I always have to bring up that chart to line it all up. So it happens, but I'm glad you're with us, and thanks for the introduction. Awesome. Okay, so to kick us off for today, we are going to use Padlet. And so last time I had you drop in the chat your thoughts on translanguaging. I am going to drop this in the chat now so you have the link. So now that you've had a chance to read a little bit more about translanguaging and see some Ophelia Garcia's video explaining it, I want us to take a moment at the beginning to answer this question again. So add a definition here, and if you've never used Padlet, in the lower right-hand corner where it says post, you just click on post, and then you can add a subject there. You can put your name if you want. And then you add below what translanguaging is. So you can go to your book right now if you want and pull out a quote. You can pull out an image that represents that translanguaging, or you can put something in your own words. But I'll give you a couple minutes now to do that. And then we'll take a look at some of the definitions that we have. So maybe what I'll do is I'll just make this full screen and they'll populate as we go. Let me know if you can't access the link for whatever reason. take about one more minute to get your thoughts up there, and then we'll share.
I'm having an issue actually being able to post onto it. I don't know what's going on.
Okay, can you get into the Padlet?
I can see the Padlet. I can see it up.
And then when you go to the lower right-hand corner, do you see the word post?
I do, and it asked me to create, and I did. And then when I hit submit, it doesn't pop up for some reason.
Hmm. That's interesting. Did it come up maybe as an anonymous? You don't have to necessarily create an account. You can also post anonymously.
I think it might have gone. Let me see. I'm trying to find it again now because I have, of course, too many things open as always.
Awesome. I see it. A few folks throwing in a second one. Go for it. Okay. And Joan, if you can't figure it out, that's all right. You can also just share verbally too.
Actually, it is there, and it came up as Portal Finder.
All right. Portal Finder.
I don't know why it came up like that. I'm like, why is it coming up like that?
Yeah, that must mean it just was like doing it anonymously, but that works too. Okay.
Okay.
No worries. Okay, perfect. Yeah, so let's take a look at some of what we've got. And I love that two of you found the same image online. Yeah, so translanguaging as a bilingual pedagogy, right? So thinking about translanguaging specifically as a way of languaging with more than one language. Using from what's already known to build upon and develop something new. I love that. So as we're looking through it together, does anyone see anything that they agree with or disagree with, or they want to add something to? Or another quote that someone put on there that they also really resonates for them.
I thought it was interesting, like you said, that a couple like myself and Emma found the same image to be useful. Um, I love the overlap in the middle, all sorts of language blending, which includes translanguaging, interlanguage, and code switching. Something I had never thought about before engaging in last week's readings was that even like monolinguals translanguage. And I thought about like how I talk with, my principal and how I talk with my friends or how I talk with my family and how I, might talk to you as my professor. And it's kind of interesting because it just makes it so transferable and we can really understand like why translanguaging is so important because I only speak English, but it's something that I do every day in every encounter, so it's something that should be encouraged in the classroom. So I just liked the language in the middle of the Venn diagram that just says all sorts of language blending.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think what I appreciate, so one, I love that you brought that connection to how monolinguals are translanguaging as well, or just recognizing that we use language differently for different purposes, right? And so if we can start to see that all humans do that, then we make more space for it, recognizing that bilinguals and multilinguals do that. They just have a broader repertoire of languages, of named languages they're drawing from when they do that. And this I like because interlanguage and code switching are older terms in the field of SLA. And, they have served an important purpose in helping us to get to a point where we understand that the complexity that is and the kind of the messiness and dynamic nature of learning languages, like learning another language and coming in speaking different languages. And also, now we're moving to a space where we're starting to say like, okay, well, are we talking about separate codes or is it a repertoire? And so it's kind of just recognizing that there is in that space, like all of this language blending is happening, right? As we're learning a new language. So I think that's a really powerful image. Yeah. Cool. Other things people notice or wanted to comment about.
I feel like a lot of people were putting like the same themes of like flexible, dynamic, multiple linguistic repertoire. So it was cool to see that everybody was kind of like on the same page and pulling out like the main themes together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Awesome. Thanks, Cassie. Yeah, definitely some kind of shared language around the flexible nature, the dynamic nature. Appreciate the social justice stance you called out.
Yeah, and I also think that like the social justice part that you called out, Cassandra, was like really big because when I think about it, when I was initially reading all these readings, I was like, oh, like language in school and like teaching just like, okay, we're teaching people how to speak another language and teaching them English and that's it. But it really is like important in their communities, like outside of school. And because when they experience like, oh, like I can only speak English or I can only use like what I'm learning, they start to like shut down in those other areas and then it leads to like other problems like learning loss or like distancing from like their families because they're not able to connect because they're told to like cut it off. Whereas when you appreciate all the different languages and they feel like they can embrace themselves fully, it's kind of like a ripple effect, I feel like. So it really is amazing to read all these and just see like, okay, like it's almost like you have the key and you can like let them just go and flourish. And translanguaging seems like it's really something that can allow students to do that.
Mhm. Yeah,
It
thank you, Shannon.
wasn't
That was so well
it
put. Go
wasn't
ahead.
in this week's reading, but it's in the second week. The video that you posted, the gift.
Mhm.
I watched that yesterday and I was just, it made me really think that, and I try and tell my students all the time that it is a gift. And some of them are just so embarrassed that they speak another language. And I don't want them to be embarrassed. And I wish I could speak another language and what a gift it is. But the video, I found it very sad that the little girl at first, she just wanted her little gift box. And it just made me think. And I was like, "Aw." So if you haven't watched it yet, when you do, you're going to think about the same thing that we're talking about right now.
Yeah, yeah, that so that the gift is a I stumbled upon that a few years ago and the first time I watched it I was like, oh, this is kind of cheesy. I'm not going to put it in my course. And then I kept thinking about it after the video and I was like, I know it's like it's kind of like a simple video in terms of like what it but it I feel like it is such a powerful message and it has stuck with me too. So that's why, Jessica, it's I keep it in the course because I think it's a simple message to that like really drives home why this is so important.
Well, I thought it would be good for like a PD at different schools too. I think it was worth because it's not very long, but I thought it was totally worth it. It just kind of really caught me.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that. And I think that speaks to what both of you were just sharing. Why translanguaging is a social justice stance, why it is about advocacy, because um, we all translanguage, right? Like we all use language differently for different purposes, and some of us do that within one named language, some of us do that within many named languages, but not that translanguaging isn't viewed in the same way for every person, right? And for students growing up in the US, and especially now as we've shifted toward more deficit language and policies toward immigrants and towards languages other than English, like it does not feel like a safe space always to use languages other than English at school, out in public. And so it's not surprising that students might not want to bring those languages in or to feel like it's safe to do that. And so translanguaging is about taking that stance and saying, no, I recognize that this is important. I recognize that this is who students are, and telling them not to bring in their full linguistic repertoire is like telling them to leave that gift behind, telling them to tie an arm behind their back and then spend the day writing in their non-dominant hand and then be surprised when they're not thriving. And so I think, it's for me, it's always it's about that flexibility and that welcoming, but it's also about recognizing that not that that these languages and language speakers do not get to enter, they don't enter classroom spaces on equal footing. And so how do we work to shift that dynamic and make it a space that's welcoming for students? Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing those ideas. Anything else? Okay. So I'm going to thank you for this. We'll revisit our definitions as we continue to go. I wanted to share this image that kind of builds upon the definition that I shared with you last week and that you've been learning about, which is kind of that interweaving of the practice, translanguaging as a practice, translanguaging as a theory, and translanguaging as a pedagogy. And so these really are kind of three components, all tied in with social justice, around recognizing that the dynamic languaging that bilingual people engage with, or the dynamic languaging of bilingual people and communities is translanguaging, right? That it's a theory for understanding what bilingualism is, that it's not double monolingualism. And some of you in your discussion post wrote about the all-terrain vehicle metaphor, and I love that way. That metaphor is a way to think about bilingualism, right? That we use language as we need it and adapt to different terrains with our linguistic repertoires. And then as a pedagogy, right? A justice-oriented, linguistically responsive pedagogy. So that is kind of the framework that we're approaching translanguaging from in this course. Okay, so apologies to Cassie and Sharon that I think have seen this already, but I also wanted to spend a little bit of time before we dive into some of the concepts, just situating translanguaging for all of you so that you know kind of where this term has come from and where it is today. I love the piece that you read, the chapter from Ofelia Garcia and Ricardo Otegui, talking about how they came to translanguaging and how it resonated for them as bilingual scholars who researched bilingualism but never found a theory that quite explained their reality until they started using translanguaging. And Otegui and Garcia are partners, they're husband and wife, and so they are scholars who've been doing this work for a long time, and then for the last couple of decades have moved into this translanguaging research. And so they talked a little bit about this. This is just be a nice visual timeline for us to have. But the term itself, translanguaging, comes from Welsh, transviethu, I believe, in Ken Williams' dissertation research. And he was researching how in bilingual classrooms in Wales, teachers were having students use Welsh and English strategically. So like reading something in Welsh and then discussing it in English as a way to support their learning. And so he referred to this kind of interplay of languages as transviethu, and Colin Baker translated it as translanguaging in his book about bilingual education and bilingualism. And when Ofelia Garcia stumbled upon that work and started thinking about it as a term, she was like, yes, this term names what I've been trying to name. And so she included it in her 2009 book, Bilingual Education in the 21st Century. And so she framed it there, she theorized it there as translanguaging. And then during this time, the field of SLA, the field of second language acquisition, was going through what some have called a multilingual turn. So stopped kind of moving away from this idea of we have an L1, we have a first language, and then we acquire a second language, and starting to think about really the more dynamic nature of bilingualism and bilingual learning through lots of terms like plurilingualism and translingual practice and polylingual languaging and metrolingualism. And academics are really good at coming up with words. And so Ofelia in that time kind of put translanguaging into that conversation, and it really took off. There's a list of some scholars in the 2010 to 2015, Lee Wei, Crease and Blackledge working in the UK, some scholars in the US like Kanakaraja, Hornberger, Link, and Lewis, and in South Africa, Makalela, McKinney, who started taking up translanguaging and thinking about it within their context and how it reflected the reality that they were seeing as bilingual individuals or as people working in bilingual education. And around that time, Ofelia got some funding from New York for this multi-year project to research translanguaging in New York City. And so that's the Kuni-Naisa project. Next week, I believe, I think week 3, you'll watch some videos from that project. Their website is an incredible resource of all of the work that they were doing during that 7-year period, supporting teachers and leaders as they took up translanguaging and thought about what it looked like in different contexts. And then theoretically, translanguaging started to shift a little bit. So there were some important pieces that came out in 2015 and 2018 that started to say translanguaging isn't just about flexible languaging. It's actually about saying that languages don't have a reality beyond our constructed reality. And this is an argument that in the field, some scholars have kind of pushed back on. And so it remains a point of debate around languaging and language and how real language is in our brains or not. But they were really trying to push back against the idea that languages are bounded, and argued more, as you read about in the book, that languages are social constructs, and that's why they use the term named languages like English, Spanish, to argue that they don't have a reality beyond the speakers that are using them that are constructing this reality. And then translanguaging also became kind of more, the social justice tenets were centered more. Ratiolinguistics became a part of the framing as we think about like whose languaging is valued and whose translanguaging is seen as acceptable or not acceptable. And so there were some important pieces that came out then, one of which you'll read, the 2021 piece we're going to read in a couple weeks as we think about language and power. And then some of the debates that have emerged are really about kind of the conceptual nature of translanguaging and is our brain really one repertoire, or are there some intersections of languages, but it's maybe more blurry than we had originally thought? Is translanguaging appropriate in all pedagogical contexts, or are there some limits to where it should be used? And so debates continue, but this is just kind of a visual of where we've headed and kind of where the research is now. And finally, the new direction. So a lot of research now is starting to think about AI and translanguaging, multimodality, so using translanguaging with different modes in different contexts, and assessment in translanguaging is a place where we need more research because we know that we might say, yes, translanguaging is a part of my classroom, but at the end of the day, students are assessed in a monolingual English assessment. And so how do we continue to push on that and think about ways of assessing with translanguaging at the forefront? So we'll talk a little bit about that when we get into the assessment weeks. So that is just for your background, a brief kind of overview of like where it started and how it's been evolving and where we are now. Any thoughts or questions seeing the timeline laid out like this? All right, and we'll move forward. And sorry, my cold is coming back full force. All right. So with that backdrop, I wanted to spend a little bit of time with some of the concepts that you were introduced to this week. Some of them may have been familiar, some of them maybe were new. And so I'll talk through a few of them and then stop and give us a chance to talk about them and then talk through a few more. Some of those concepts were ways to think about language and bilingualism, and some of them were ways to think about bilingual and multilingual learning spaces. So we'll start with, actually, before we go into the weeds with this, were there any concepts that are on this list that you were already familiar with? Feel free to unmute or drop in the chat, ones that you had already heard before you signed up for this course.
I think I heard the term code switching before, but I knew it was different from translanguaging, but I couldn't remember how because I think I learned that in like EDC 420, but it was interesting to read about the difference last week again.
Yeah. Yes, and I'll have a slide where we'll talk about that too. But yes, yeah. So code switching and translanguaging, kind of code switching predates translanguaging. Code switching research started in the 70s. So we've had has a long legacy as a way to think about the ways bilinguals language, and then translanguaging is kind of trying to push into a new way of thinking about what that intermixing is. Yeah, thanks, Andy. Any other terms that were familiar to you? Awesome. And so Danielle, you'd heard of some of those before. Is that from TESOL coursework or other places?
Yeah, this is actually I have two classes after this one, and then I'll have finished my TESOL classes. So I feel like I've definitely heard of code switching before. And we did talk about translanguaging in another course that I had taken. I can't remember what number it was or which one. And then I just took another course in the spring that really talks about racio. I don't know if I say it right, ratio-linguistic ideologies.
Yeah, that's right.
So that was the multicultural class. So yeah, I mean, all of those are kind of things that I've heard during this coursework. But this one is really just diving into translanguaging more, and giving a broader overview on everything.
Awesome. Good. Well, I'm glad to hear that we're not failing at integrating these across our program. So it's heard this before. Awesome. And Sai, it looks like you've been exposed to some of these as well, named language and translanguaging.
Yeah, I actually heard of code switching my senior year at URI for a writing course. It was actually really interesting that you put it in week one for How to Tame a Wild Tongue by Gloria Anzaldúa.
Mhm.
And that was the first time I was exposed to code switching. And that was actually the first time I read a text that I really related to. And I was like, wow, I'm a senior in college, and this is the first time that I like read something that I really identified with. So I thought that was really interesting. And then translanguaging, I kind of recently heard about in previous TESOL coursework. So it's kind of interesting to see the differences between the two terms.
Yeah, yeah. And if you haven't read Gloria Anzaldua's whole book, Borderlands, where that comes from, it's fabulous, and I think you would love it. So, How to Tame a Wild Tongue is like one part of her book, Borderlands. La Frontera. Yeah. So, yeah, her work is awesome. Um, Great, cool. Well, then some of this will be familiar, so I won't spend too much time. And you've also been exposed to this through the readings, but just so you have working, I'm hoping that we can start to use these terms and make them part of our repertoire as we're engaging in this course as well. So emergent bilingual is a term that Ofelia Garcia introduced to reframe the word English learner, which only focuses on students in terms of what they're trying to acquire, right? That they're learning English, as opposed to recognizing that when they are learning English, they are becoming bilingual. In Rhode Island, we have another acid-oriented term that we use, multilingual learner. So either is great, but I always think it's good to try to make sure we're using acid-oriented language when we're talking about our students, whether it's emergent bilingual, multilingual learner. I know in the book they also say experienced bilingual for a student that's maybe not in EL anymore in terms of the label, but now they are kind of an like what we would maybe say in Rhode Island, like a exited English learner, exited MLL, so calling them an experienced bilingual. So finding other ways we can make sure that we're honoring the bilingualism that students are bringing. Language repertoire, you saw that in the reading, sometimes called linguistic repertoire as well, is just the name for an individual's unique language system. The fancy word that linguists sometimes use for that is idiolect. So it just basically means like your unique language system is your language repertoire. And that's where Ophelia and Kate Seltzer and colleagues have tried to push and say like what bilinguals and multilinguals have in their mind is not separate languages, but one holistic repertoire that has all of their these language features. Some of those features belong to English, some of those features belong to Spanish. If we were to kind of tease them out, some would be difficult to put with one or the other. They kind of feel like they're a mix of both or they're used by both. And so they're trying to argue that those features may belong to different languages, but the repertoire inside of someone's mind is holistic. And then they use the word named language to draw attention to the fact that these things are social constructs, right? That we have named them as such. We call this thing Spanish. We call this thing English. But that is not the reality of the mind, that these things exist as entities. It is because we have decided where to draw the boundaries around them. And I'm glad many of you talked about Dr. Jamila Lisket's video in your reflection for this week, because I think she does such a good job of unpacking English, right? And showing how, we might say this is where I'm drawing the boundary around English, but all of the different ways that she languages with English and beyond English that really push back against that. And then how certain varieties are seen as more appropriate or more acceptable than others, which is very much, influenced by historical, political, ideological forces. And then dynamic bilingualism is a term that is meant to describe how bilingualism is lived in the world, right? That it's fluid and ever changing. And so trying to really push back against this idea of bilingualism as being two separate language systems. And that's where Ophelia is like the queen of metaphors. So bilingualism as an all-terrain vehicle, bilingualism as a banyan tree with all of its roots connecting back to the ground and growing underneath the surface. And so we might see individual trees popping up, but underneath they're all connected and all of the roots are able to sprout new trees and new branches. So kind of seeing bilingualism through that lens as opposed to as kind of acquiring an additional language. And the last one, I think, before I'll open it up for questions, is code switching versus translanguaging, which is always something that comes up in this course. So as I mentioned before, code switching has a long history and really laid the foundation for translanguaging research. Code switching scholars in the 1970s and 1980s were documenting how bilinguals use language, and they were trying to show that bilinguals code switch in predictable ways, in ways that were rule governed, and so bilinguals weren't just like confused when they were using more than one language. They were trying to show that that was a normal way of being bilingual. And translanguaging scholars then said, okay, great, but let's not talk about like switching between codes. A better way to describe that would be what they're doing is translanguaging. And so if we were to look at this sample text here, and this is from the course textbook, from one of the teacher examples, This is from Sandra Cisneros' book, and it says, the big box came marked do not open till Christmas, but Mama said not until the Day of the Three Kings, not until Dia de los Reyes, the 6th of January, do you hear? So a code switching perspective would say this person, the character, is using English, and then they switch a couple times into Spanish. A translanguaging perspective would say that this person is using their whole linguistic repertoire to communicate with their family. So the same example could be code switching if we're saying we're naming different codes, or we could say this is translanguaging if we're coming from a different theoretical perspective to what we're seeing. Yes, there are features of Spanish used in this and features of English, but it's an example of translanguaging. So I'll pause there. Questions or thoughts about this or about anything that came before it?
I'm sorry. I'm still having a hard time grasping the difference between the code switching and translanguaging. So what exactly is that like main factor that really puts them apart? I
Yeah,
just need a more concrete, like, what is
yes,
it?
yes. So I would say the more concrete thing is it's the kind of the stance that you are taking as you look at this example. So if I am viewing it as code switching, I am saying I see a person here using English and then switching into Spanish and then switching back into English and then switching into Spanish and then switching back into English. So it's kind of it's the stance that I'm taking toward it. If I am approaching this from a translanguaging stance, I am saying this is an example of a person drawing upon their whole linguistic repertoire to communicate with their family because they are bilingual, their family members are bilingual, and so they're just drawing upon the resources that are part of their linguistic repertoire.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, no problem. And you also could say translanguaging, I think maybe even goes beyond code switching because when we look at translanguaging pedagogies, we might say if a student is reading something in English and they're annotating on the side in Spanish, that's translanguaging. They're using their whole repertoire, but code switching, that's not code switching because code switching is only when we are seeing English and Spanish being used together. So if I'm writing with English and I'm writing with Spanish. That's code switching. Whereas translanguaging would say like, yes, that also can be translanguaging as well as any example of a student bringing their whole linguistic repertoire to communicate, to learn, to engage with others.
Can you repeat what you just said about the code switching again, it's going from one language to another language? Is that what it is?
Right. So traditionally, how it's been understood is it's just naming the codes that are being switched, right? So going from English to Spanish and back again. Whereas
Where
translanguaging,
translanguaging is just using the knowledge that the person has to communicate.
right.
Okay.
Right. So it's bringing your language features to communicate, right? So those could be features from English, features from Spanish, but the goal of moving away from code switching is that translanguaging scholars are trying to get us not to be thinking about isolated codes all the time, but to be thinking about ourselves and our bilingual and multilingual students as having these more holistic repertoires that they're drawing from and that we should create opportunities for them to draw from, especially when they're in classrooms.
So the code switching is it's really compartmentalizing the uses of things. Whereas translanguaging, like you're saying, goes across all.
Right. I think, yeah, some of the ways that scholars have talked about translanguaging is like seeing the trans prefix as meaning transcending, right? So kind of transcending language. So going across language and drawing upon all of the resources that are part of your repertoire, rather than seeing someone as when they are code switching, they're kind of moving between codes that they have in their repertoire. Yeah.
This might be a little bit of a tangent, so you can stop me if it is. But when we were doing the I am from poems and you linked the text Authors in the Classroom, A Transformative Education Process by Alma Florada. When I taught in New York, my first graders had a whole unit on poetry and it was all on Alma Florada. It was like an author study. And while parts of it I felt were very dense for first graders, it was really incredible to teach some of Alma Florada's books. And the book that comes to mind when we're talking about code switching and translanguaging is her book, called I Love Saturdays y Domingos. And it talks about, it's like this little girl telling a story about how on Saturdays she visits one side of her grandparents and hangs out with them. And then on Domingos, she spends time with her like Spanish speaking grandparents. And it's just such like an incredible like view and like real life example of, this translanguaging that can happen in kids. And it was just a great book to show the first graders, especially because I had some Spanish speakers in my room. So I just wanted to put that in there.
I love it. We have that book at my home as well, and my daughters love it. So it's a perfect age. That's a perfect age for it. Yeah, and I think that to me connects really to this idea of bilingualism being dynamic. Even though in the book she's using English with one set of grandparents and Spanish with the other, so we're seeing how she's using language differently and in monolingual ways. And I think it's important to point out that like bilingual people aren't necessarily just translanguaging all the time. Like
Right.
sometimes, yes, when they're with other bilingual people. But it's that to me really speaks to that like all-terrain vehicle, right? Like we're using language as we need it for different purposes with different audiences. And so the ability to be like, okay, with this family, I'm living my life in English, and with this part of my family, I'm living my life in Espanol. And then maybe when I'm at home with my parents, I'm doing both, right? And it's a more fluid space. I think it's a great way to kind of lift up that right bilingual children may be languaging in different ways, sometimes monolingually, but that doesn't mean that they're losing that the dynamic nature that is bilingualism. Yeah, thanks for that example, Chloe. And Alma Florada is wonderful, and I'm glad you like that book.
Yeah, it was really cool.
Yeah,
I had no idea about her before I started teaching. Um, so it was like a cool, a lot of, I was at, I don't know, never mind. But yeah, it was, I could go on and on, but it was a really great unit out of all of the units that we taught. It was definitely my favorite.
that's awesome. Yeah, her book is called Authors in the Classroom. If you want to check it, that's her pedagogical teacher focused book that gives you different strategies for how to bring more multilingual writing projects into your classroom. Awesome. Thanks, Chloe. Okay, and that looks like there's one more that I want to make sure we cover. Ratiolinguistic ideologies, which has already been mentioned, is an important concept that's been linked to translanguaging in the last decade or so. And that's really ratiolinguistic ideologies is about recognizing that society judges the speech of people of color often as deficient, not because of any objective linguistic flaws, but because of racial stigma attached to the speaker. And so the reason why it's important that translanguaging also thinks about ratiolinguistic ideologies is because that not all language practices, like I was saying before, like enter into the space in the same way, right? So certain accents might be lifted up as prestigious to have, like if you have a French accent, perhaps, or a British accent, whereas if you have Spanish accented English, that might be viewed as something that's a problem that needs to be fixed, right? Or certain varieties of English are socially constructed as inferior because of the race of the people who speak them, not because they are inferior varieties, right? And so I think as we think about translanguaging, it's important to not lose sight of the fact that these racial-linguistic ideologies exist. They are in the world. And so doing the work of translanguaging and translanguaging pedagogy is about thinking about how we can combat these and how we can lift up the language practices and language varieties that have traditionally been sidelined or viewed as not welcome in school or not welcome at all. And I think that is the last one. Yes. So I'm going to go back actually to that first slide that had the terms again. We already talked about a few of them, but anything else from that first list of language and bilingualism terms, things that stood out to you as we were just looking at that together, or questions you have, or ahas you had as we were looking at them?
I really was confused on the code switching and translanguaging when I was reading it. But I think under my understanding now is like the example, so you can have the same example for code switching and for translanguaging. It's really just how you explain it and like your perspective on it. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. And
Good.
then translanguaging can go, yes. So yes, and translanguaging can be even more than code switching is. So an example of code switching can be an example of translanguaging depending on the lens I'm bringing to what I'm looking at. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then the ratio list linguistic ideologies, that's really interesting to me because it is very apparent, especially in like I teach in Providence, so I'm in like an urban area. And it's just like it's a complete melting pot, like parents. And when we have meetings, like I'm a special ed teacher. So we have a lot of meetings with all different types of parents. And um, you can just tell like some of them even come into the meetings with like not as much confidence as other parents who come in with like, do you know what I mean? Like just so I understand like the ratio linguistic ideologies and I can see how that can affect people.
Yeah, and how it plays out. I mean, certainly intersects with different facets of our schools and classrooms, right? How it plays out in interactions with families and with students, and how people those can become internalized too for some folks. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah. Thanks, Shannon.
Um, just to piggyback a little bit off Shannon, well, first off, I didn't realize that that was the term used for such a experience, if you will, because I've experienced that most of my life, especially, with my background in the Middle East and stuff like that. So I've kind of faced these things, but didn't know what the term was. And yes, I can also see it within certain families and students and such, or conversations I might have with people like, yes, I went to a British international curriculum. Oh, British. It's the same. You know what I mean? It's very interesting to see that dynamic. Or where I'm from, it's very common for people to speak three, sometimes four languages fluently. When I came here, it was very shocking to see the look of like, you speak how many? As if it was like a bad thing. I'm like, wait, what? You use more parts of your brain, right? When you can speak
Right.
more.
Yeah. I mean,
Very interesting.
the cognitive science on bilingualism is like definitive. Like it is better to speak more languages for your brain health by far. Yeah. And I think in English speaking countries, they're like English dominant countries, there can be a tendency to think that most of the world is monolingual. But that is certainly not the case, right? The majority of the world is bilingual, multilingual. But I think in the UK, in the US, and Australia and South Africa, because English is so dominant and because you can live your life being monolingual in English, a monolingual English speaker in these places, there is kind of a warped perception. Whereas if you leave that world, you start to realize, right, that the world outside of those countries looks quite different, and even within them, but you can have blinders on. Yeah, thank you, Sai, for sharing that. I'm glad to hear that you've got a name for your experience, but I'm sorry that that has been your experience. There's a great book by Jonathan Rosa called Looking Like a Language, Sounding Like a Race, where he really teases out how, people can like hear race when they hear someone speak. They like there's that you can't separate race and language when we're thinking about equity. And it's a great book if you want to dive deeper into that. Awesome. Yeah, I mean, I'll send it out or I'll drop it in somewhere in our notes from the class so you have it. Awesome. Okay, let's look at a couple other concepts. So with bilingual learning spaces, you learned this week about the translanguage and classroom framework. We're going to continue to dive into these three tenets throughout this course. The translanguaging stance, which is what we're going to be thinking about closely this week, kind of that the attitude, the belief system that we need to develop as teachers, in which we recognize that students bring all of their linguistic resources into our classroom, and we need to make space for that. So the stance that we take, translanguaging design, which is the purposeful design of translanguaging pedagogies, and translanguaging shifts, which is kind of being willing in the moment to follow the translanguaging corriente, right? So if you see an opportunity to tap into a student's linguistic resources, that you do it, right? So that we leave ourselves open for those shifts, those teachable moments when we can bring students full linguistic repertoires into our classroom. So that is the framework that guides this book that we'll keep coming back to. We're going to talk a lot this week about multilingual ecologies because you're going to be thinking about the linguistic landscapes of your schools or of a community in Rhode Island. Or where you live. And so multilingual ecology is a school or classroom space in which multiple languages are used and valued, and where students' language and cultural practices and understandings are seen as resources for learning. So I know I've walked into a multilingual ecology when I enter a classroom and I see signs like the ones you see on the slide, right? I see we're English and Spanish together on the wall supporting student learning, or I see examples of Mandarin supporting how students are learning about historical vocabulary. So seeing students' languages visible on the wall is what we think about. We think about a multilingual ecology, but what we see and also kind of what we hear, what students experience as they enter that space. Another term that was thrown out there. How many of you were familiar with the zone of proximal development? Is that something that you remember from your teacher days? So that's the idea, right? That students learn best when they're in that zone between what they already know, and they can already do, and what they can't do at all, and they don't know. That space of what they can do and what they can learn with assistance, right? And so bilingual zone of proximal development is arguing that for bilingual students, that type of assistance, when it's offered bilingually, is a way to support them and get them into that learning zone, right? To stretch their learning, to support their learning. So that's Louis Moll's term that I think is a helpful way to think about like what it means to provide those language specific scaffolds. And I mentioned the corriente already. So they use this term in the book, right? The current, the corriente, is what they envision flowing through the classroom. That movement of language features that change our monolingual classrooms into spaces, and that says molingual, should say monolingual, that change our classrooms into spaces where all students' language practices are welcome and can flow freely into the classroom. I'll pause there because that was a few different terms thrown at you. Any initial thoughts or questions? Okay. All right, I'll end with this and then we're going to wrap up here. So the last one that's important, and we'll come back to this again, is this idea of general linguistic performance versus language specific performance. And basically what this means is there are times in the classroom when we want to know what a student can do in a specific language, language specific performance, right? And there are times when we want to know what a student knows and can do from their whole linguistic repertoire. And so the authors use this distinction to help us think about, as educators, when does it make sense for me to say, this is something that I want students to do in English, for example, and I'm going to provide sentence frames, I'm going to give them visuals, and I'm going to provide a modified text and everything in English because I want to see what they can do in English versus when is it, it's more important that they understand the content. It's more important that they can access this in whatever language they need to access this in. And I'm really just interested in what they know and can do and show me they can do from a general linguistic performance. And so this is a kind of a framing I want to come back to as we continue to think about applying this to pedagogy, because there are times when we want to make sure we're supporting students to be trying things and doing things in English. But everything doesn't need to be done in English for students to be learning and showing us what they know and can do. And so sometimes there's teachers who kind of go all the way on the other end. They're like, I'm just going to be translanguaging all the time. I'm going to translate all the materials and send everything home in their home language. And so it's kind of recognizing like we also need to provide access to English and help them support them to get there if they're acquiring English as a new language. But not everything has to be in English either. So kind of finding that middle space and being really purposeful and when we make decisions about what should be language specific and what benefits from being general linguistic performance. And this framing for me was a really helpful. When I first came to translanguaging work, I was like, yes, this makes sense that we need to think about this really carefully and strategically. Yeah, so what are any thoughts or questions about this idea or any of the other ones? I'll go back to that main slide again so you can see the list. There.
I was a little bit confused with the difference between general linguistic performance and language specific until now. Now, once you explained it, I feel like now I really understand it. And just like after listening to you thinking about different types of testing that we do, and most of it being only in English. So obviously that would all be language specific performance, but some of the things that we are assessing could be content where we could maybe be using general linguistic performance instead. So just kind of thinking about that like in my own practice and just for future, when I am assessing students on different types of things.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, I mean, unfortunately, our standardized tests it's just really hard to get them to move beyond this monolingual English frame. But like for example, even like a reading comprehension
Yeah.
test, like I want to know if they comprehend this passage in English. Great. Do I care if they tell me what they comprehended in Spanish?
Right.
That, right? Like if they can show me that they understood it, but they're explaining it to me in Spanish, they're still showing me they understood what they were reading in English. And so I
Right.
think there's a lot of places where we could think about like, okay, what should be what should be just in one language and where do I have flexibility there? Whereas there might be other times when like I want to see what you can produce in a given language so I
Right.
know like how your English language development is going, right? Or if you're in a bilingual program, how your Spanish language development is going and how your English language development is going. But other times I want to see what you can just do by drawing upon everything.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
This reminded me, one of my students and I were talking, she's 18, so she just took her, she didn't take driver's ed, so she just took her permit test. And she said she went to the DMV and she did it on the computer. And I said, we were just talking about what language she was going to take it in. She said originally Spanish, but when she got there, she could go back and forth, be depending on what she wanted to do for each question. So she said that some of the questions she put in English because they were easier for her to understand, but then some of the questions she didn't understand what they meant, so she put it in Spanish. So she liked the fact that out there in the real world, she could go back and forth depending on what she needed. I
Yeah.
just thought it was interesting because I didn't know that they did that.
Wouldn't it be great if our schools did that more? That's
I
wonderful. Yeah.
I have a friend of mine who is her primary language is German, but she learned English and several other languages. And she was telling me about a time that she ran into an issue with at her doctor's office because her doctor, she had broken her foot or something, and the doctor was telling her you can put weight on it, but because of the language difference, he didn't tell her how much weight, so she took it as she could put all her weight on it. And so she messed it up by doing that. And so she actually had a conversation with him and said, you need to get better at being clearer with how you're communicating things with individuals where English is not their first language.
Yeah. So an example of how things can be lost in translation when we
Exactly.
don't offer things in other languages, and also when we're not always recognizing that things can be misinterpreted depending on how you share them. Yeah.
And that comes into play a lot, like especially when students are reading something. They could read if they read it in their language, they have the understanding of it. But if they read it in English, it has a different meaning because of the words that are used.
You're saying so like if they have something that's translated versus if it's in.
Correct.
Yeah. Yeah, and so I think there's a lot of interesting nuances we think about, how are we providing access and how are we making sure we're giving students the most supports in learning content while also helping provide access to learning English or learning whatever.
It was in the readings too. There was something, I can't remember what the exact words were, but like the kids, when they translated to help the student that didn't know the meaning, they didn't actually know the meaning because to them, the words they're multi-meaning words and they had the wrong meaning themselves. And it was just really interesting to read that because even when I was testing a student, I had the mom translating for me because we didn't have it was Egyptian, it was Arabic with Egyptian dialects. So I didn't have a test with that language. So the mom was translating and the child was supposed to point to the fattest cat and she looked at me and she was like, fattest? What's fattest? They don't have that word, like they don't have anything equivalent in their language. So it's definitely something to think about.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. And I see Emma dropped it was more likely, the example of translating what more likely means. And they were like, I can't, más probable, I can't remember the different ways they were taking it that were not, the teacher was able to clarify, but recognizing that, right, just translating doesn't always get us there, kind of like teasing out the nuance of a meaning and that words can have multiple meanings across the languages. Yeah,
Thank
thank
you,
you.
Emma. I couldn't remember what the words were. I just knew.
Yeah, thank you. All right, I'm going to move us through all that. Okay, so I think we're gonna get into groups to share our identity texts. And I think what I want you to do is we're gonna start with our language portraits and have everyone do the language portraits. And then depending on time, if you have time, you can then do a round with the poems. And if you don't, I think we'll start with the language portraits because that will tie us directly to languages. If we don't have time for the poems, I'll make sure that I'll put them all in a folder so you can all see one another's poems as well. Um, so in a moment, you will be in a group, and it'll be a chance to share what you put and why, and have a little bit of a chance for questions and before we come back again. I'm going to skip my poems since we're just going to do the portraits. But I wanted to share mine quickly as an example of what I did and then let you get into your groups to share. So I do this every year, and every year mine looks totally different. And so I think it's an interesting way to reflect on how our language repertoires continue to evolve. For me, most of my body continues to be English. It's my dominant language, the language that I mostly interact with in the world. But Spanish, Portuguese, and Polish are all part of my life. Spanish, especially. I lived in Chile for 3 years. I lived in Texas for 2 years. I use Spanish almost every day. And this year, I put all three colors on my feet because I feel like I have been able to see a lot of different places of the world and meet different people and interact with different folks because of the other languages that I'm learning. I'll be in Poland this July studying Polish for the first time to try to learn my heritage language. I studied Portuguese in Brazil years ago, trying to do the same, not because it was a heritage language, but because it was a language many of my students were speaking. And my sunglasses this year are Spanish because I feel like Spanish was the first language I learned well after English, and it really has shaped the way I see the world and myself in it and my role in it and the work I do. So yeah, so that's a little bit about me. In Polish, my grandma's language is in my heart and connects me to my family. Okay, so something like that with your groups. Share what you did and why, and then if you want to talk a little bit about what it was like doing that assignment, great. I'm going to put you in groups for about 15 minutes, so you probably will just have time to get through the language portraits. If you have extra time, feel free to jump into the poetry, and then we'll come on back. So let me make the groups. And while I'm doing this, if you want to open up, find your language portrait so you have it ready to share. All right. Okay, the rooms are open. I'll play you back in 15 minutes. Andy, do you see an invitation to join? Start that again. Okay, great. Awesome. Well, welcome back, everybody. Was everyone able to share their language portrait, the picture? Okay, awesome. Great. Well, I want to make sure we have enough time to talk about what's coming for this week, but did anyone want to share just a quick reflection on what it was like to do this or share it, or what you learned from engaging with your small group?
It's just more like a comment. I thought Megan had a really cool aspect of her language portrait. She included her stomach, which I thought was awesome, like calling back to like her Italian heritage. And we were the three of us. I was with Sharon as well. We were talking about like how language is like food is an expression and a language and a culture too. So I thought that was really awesome. I wouldn't have thought to include my stomach in my portrait.
I love that. Yeah, students do that a lot too, and I do it with them because it is like language is so tied to our food. I found that when I was writing my poem, I was like pierogies. So I love that you included that. Awesome. Thanks.
My group had a really interesting conversation about like ASL and like if that's like also a language, and we agreed that it was, and we were talking about how like you can like, especially if you're working with students who like struggle to communicate verbally, they could like use ASL in a translanguaging way. Like if they like want more of something, they could be like, can I have, and then they could do this instead of saying it, which is like an example of translanguaging with ASL. So Daniela was the one that like used ASL, and it was like a really cool conversation to think about using that as a language.
Yeah, yes. So folks who speak ASL have fought for a long time for it to be recognized as a named language. And certainly, just as we can teach students like words here and there of different languages, like supporting students to learn ASL can, like you said, Cassie, help them engage and also just expands their repertoire. But yes, definitely. I always love when I see that ASL is a part of folks' repertoires because it's a really important language to speak or to be able to use to communicate. Yeah, awesome. All right, I would love to dive in for longer, but I want to make sure that I let you out on time. So the class always goes faster than I think it will. I want to give you a preview into where you are headed for this week, and then have any questions you have, you can ask before we hop off. So this week, like I mentioned before, we're diving into what it means to hold a translanguaging stance. We're thinking about the social justice component of holding a translanguaging stance. The readings and the viewings for this week are so good. Oh, I lied. This week is the week you're reading the piece from Ophelia and Nelson Flores and others. I had mentioned earlier, I thought it was week 3. So this week you are going to be watching a really short video from Gorder and Sanoz where they talk about thinking about multilingualism in classrooms. They're both scholars who work in the Basque Country in Spain, and so they'll talk a little bit about their multilingual reality. You have got 2 chapters from our book, a really great article from Julian Delgado Lopera talking about Spanglish and their Spanglish growing up and in their family. I recently learned that Julian has a TED Talk, and I watched it today, and it's so good. So I'll link it as something optional you can check out if you want to also hear Julian explaining basically what you'll read in the article. And then the final piece is Garcia and colleagues' article, really bringing the ideas of racial-linguistic ideologies and translanguaging together, and arguing why we need translanguaging now more than ever in our classrooms. So that's where you're headed in terms of the content. And then there is that video about the gift that Jessica mentioned that I added because I think it's powerful and it's short, and I hope you enjoy it as well. Your project for this week will be a linguistic landscape presentation, and you have the option of making a schoolscape or a linguistic landscape. What this means is you are going to either in your school building or in a multilingual community, document the languages that you see. So take pictures of the languages you see for Schoolscape. That just means walking through your building, documenting what you see on the walls. It is very common for the languages to mostly be or exclusively be English, and that's okay because you're trying to think about who is in this building, who are the students, who are what are the languages that are spoken by the people who are here, and what languages do we see? And so it's common to not find a lot of multilingualism, but maybe you will. And so I want you to think about the environmental print and what it tells us about how languages are valued. So that's option 1. Option 2 is to go to a place where you know you will see languages other than English, or you know a multilingual community lives, and to document what you see about the environmental print and what it tells you about who lives in the community and how languages are valued in that space. You can do either one. So just to give you an example of like what one photo might look like in a linguistic landscape, this is the image of a laundromat in South Providence on La Broa. You'll see this example on our week slide, our week page as well in Brightspace. And so as you look at something like this, thinking about, what do you notice about how language is being used, right? So anyone who wants to, or for sake of time, maybe I'll just share some thoughts. So for example, we see free dry every day, gratis secar todos los días, right? So we see Spanish, right, and English. And so it indexes to me that this is probably a bilingual community. We still see English being used in like a bit bigger font and a bit bolder. So that maybe says something just about language and power, and English still kind of having a dominant presence in this image, even though the community is very heavily Spanish speaking. It's the Dominican part of South Providence. A lot of Dominican families live in this area. But it communicates some things to me about language and power. Also communicates to me that this is probably a place where they speak Spanish and English if I need to do my laundry, right? So it tells something to the consumers about who goes there, who this space is for. And so finding, if you're going to do the linguistic landscape, take pictures, and in your presentation, you're going to be analyzing them, but also situating us in the context as much as you can of what you know about who lives there and what you see or don't see representing those folks. If you're doing a school, same thing. Maybe you see languages other than English, maybe you don't. And if you don't, again, that's definitely something to think about. This is an example of bilingual photo, and this is from my colleague Steve Prismus from Texas. And even in a bilingual setting, we see examples of how languages are being privileged, right? So you notice in the visitor lunch schedule, the English ones are in color, the Spanish translations are not, they're bigger. The word visitor lunch schedule is bolded in English and the translation is not in Spanish. English is on the left side for notice. Aviso is on the in Spanish on the right side. So which one comes first? And so even in bilingual places where we're trying to intentionally lift up both languages, we can unintentionally still be privileging one language over another. And so as you're looking around, if you're thinking about, where do you see languages other than English show up and why, and who is the community that is there that we would expect to be there or is absent. And so the project itself is a presentation. So you'll be taking these pictures and then putting them into some slides. The recording should be, or the presentation will be about 5 to 7 minutes. And so that I can see them all, I want you to record them and submit them so I can watch them. But then you'll be giving them, I'm going to put you in breakout rooms for much longer. So each of you has a chance to give your presentation in your group. It's okay if it's a little bit longer than 7 minutes, but just so we have time for everyone to share, that's usually a good range. And make sure you have, a variety of images. So more than just one image, of course, like as many images as you can to capture what you're seeing. And please make sure you frame the context. So if you're doing a schoolscape, what is the school? What is the population of the school? How many multilingual learners? What languages do they speak? Like as much information as you can give us to help us contextualize it. And same thing if you go to a neighborhood, what is the language spoken? Who are the people that live in that neighborhood? What languages do they speak? As much information as you can give us so that we can contextualize what we're seeing. So you'll introduce that, you'll present it, and you'll analyze the photos. So don't just show them, but analyze them. Tell us what we see in terms of language and power, and who's absent and who's not who is present. And then at the end, kind of reflecting on what was it like to do this, whether you did it in your own school and you're thinking about your school space or somewhere in a community, what did you learn? So that is very briefly what it will be. And this is how I'm grading it, just so you know. So I'm looking for the wide variety of photos, the description that you include, the analysis you do, and then your reflection. All right, so that was my speedy way to get us to 6 o'clock and make sure that I covered all that. But any questions that folks have, and I will also stay on if people are good. Yeah, Jessica.
So, are you saying that suppose we work in a school that we mainly see English? It's still okay to go around and take pictures of that as long as we're analyzing it?
Yeah. So, for
Okay.
example, sometimes folks will take a picture of a bulletin board, and most of the things or all of the things will be in English, and they'll say some of this information like parents need to know, and it's not available in other languages. And so you can also think about like, are there spaces where you would expect you should find more languages, or in a school space where like students are like talking about who they are, maybe there it would be you would want to see students able to showcase their multilingualism too. So it's definitely fine. And yes, then it gives you a chance to kind of think critically about, what's absent, knowing who's in the building and what's on the walls.
And could we do like next steps of what we think would be a good idea?
Sure. Yes. So in your analysis or in your reflection, you could kind of talk about this is what I was reflecting on is like what our school should do differently.
Okay, that made me feel better. I thought I was going to have to go somewhere. I thought I wouldn't be able to use my own school.
No, yeah, and I would say that's the common schoolscape
Okay.
is unfortunately, this is a monolingual reality, but sometimes you'll find like maybe other languages that you didn't think were there once you start looking. And if not, I think that's a useful data point to bring back to a school
And
leader.
Braille, we can use Braille too.
Sure.
Perfect. Thank you.
I have a question. We're putting like our closing thoughts and analysis. Are we putting that on a slide as well, or do you want that in a separate document?
So everything can be part of the presentation.
Okay.
And that's why I'm having you record them for Sunday. So upload them so that I can watch them. But you don't have to turn in any other, you'll submit the slides and you'll send in the recording. And then when we have class, I'll put you in groups and you'll have a chance to give that presentation so you can learn together in a small group, but you don't need to submit anything separate.
Okay. And then this is going to sound really silly, but for the for the recording, is there like any specific app that people use? Or I feel like I'm like 95 asking this question.
I use Canva, make the slideshow in
Okay.
Canva, and you can record it on there.
And you can record in Canva. Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
I've also used, this is like my hack. I've done Canva and I've used Zoom, where like you can go into your own Zoom and like share your screen and record yourself on Zoom. That's also
Okay.
been like super, super easy.
Yeah, that's how I do most of my recordings is I just use
Okay.
Zoom and then I take that Zoom video and I upload it onto YouTube and then I provide the YouTube link. So that's another way you can do it. Or if you do it on Zoom, you can download the video file too.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes, the Canva I know is a popular way. Okay, I'm going to wrap us up there so that folks can hop off if they want to, but I will stay on if people have more questions. Have a lovely rest of your week. I can't wait to see your presentations and feel free to reach out if you have questions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Laura,
you.
this doesn't have to do with class, but was that near Public and Broad?
Yeah, it was.